right? So I'll never forget, this philosophy of religion was the very first class that I took when I was in community college. And I had never seen people argue and like not hate each other at the end of it before. It was like such a new phenomenon for me. And so I think we need more of that in the world. I think we need to be able to disagree with each other and not hold other people, you know, hold it against them that we disagree with them about certain things. But we do have to figure out, right, what sort of responsibility we think we have towards our own beliefs, right? And that's going to be something that we'll have to consider because we're going to be assessing religious beliefs. Now, we're not going to be assessing the people who hold them, right? And we're not going to be saying whether or not these beliefs are true or false, right? That's not for any of us to say. But we are going to be assessing various arguments for believing certain things, right? Or certain critiques of those arguments, right? Where either from people who agree with them, right? So you can disagree with someone and still be like, we agree that a God exists, but maybe I disagree about how you got there, right? The reasoning that you used is not right. Or I agree with your reasoning, but it doesn't lead to your conception of God. It leads to this conception of God over here, right? So there's lots of different ways that we can disagree with one another. It doesn't mean that we're always at odds, right? So everything in the world is not as binary as we like to pretend that it is, right? That things are not just one way or another. There's lots of possibilities. And so that is what this class aims to show you, are not just, you know, a set of answers to your questions, right? Or to the questions that we're going to be looking at in this class, but lots of possible answers, right? And our job is to learn how to assess the strengths and weaknesses of those views so that you can go out into the world and know how to handle new problematic situations, right? Where you have to make up your mind about something. Okay, because most of the time, and this is something that is not always easy for us to admit to ourselves, but hopefully we're of the age that we can. Most of the things that we believe were taught to us at an age where we probably weren't allowed or encouraged to question those teachings, right? And now, again, that's a generalization. Maybe you grew up in a like super like critical thinking oriented household. Right, that allowed you to question anything and everything and talk through everything. And I hope that that was the case for you. Unfortunately, though, that is not often the case, especially when it comes to religious belief. Fortunately, a lot of people see questioning those things as a sign of disrespect, as an insult. And our goal this week, and you'll realize that the content for this week doesn't even talk about religion yet, right? The goal for this week is just to understand the value of asking questions, right? Regardless of what those questions happen to be about, right? Yes, for our class, the questions will be about religion. But why is it valuable to ask questions at all, right? And so the first reading that I assigned for you is just a short chapter from Bertrand Russell, who's like, I'm sorry, stereotypical old white British philosopher dude. Right? If you watch the interviews with him, he's like with the pipe and the elbow patches, like the cliche of all cliches. But he makes some really beautiful points that I think are really pertinent today. And one of the things that he talks about is how when we fail to ask questions, it creates a certain type of person, right? The type of person who doesn't ask questions about the world around them is someone who has everything figured out, right? Things are very simple to them. They know this, they know that, they know what's right, they know what's wrong. Nothing ever sparks their intellectual curiosity. Maybe you know some people like this, right? I know lots of people like this, right? Bertrand Russell is going to say that these people are in a prison of their own mind, right? A prison that has been created by custom, right? Things that they have been taught without their consent or their reason. And so that part really stuck out to me. I don't know about you all, but like consent and autonomy are very important to me. Again, not sure about you, but if that sort of thing matters to you, I don't know about you, but I would certainly want to have given my consent for the things that I believe, right? The things in my own head. And that's really what we want to ask ourselves is how often have we given ourselves a chance to sit through and go through the things that we already think we know and ask ourselves really, well, why do I actually think that? Right? What are my reasons? Where did those reasons come from? Are they good reasons? And if they're not, well, if that belief is important to you, you better get some better reasons for it, right? If they're not very good reasons, they're not going to stand up to very much defense, right? So one of the things that I want to encourage us is that, with regards to religious belief, right? Religious beliefs are the things that people tend to hold the most sacred when they have them. And if something is really important to you, wouldn't you want to know everything about it that you could? Wouldn't you want to be prepared to defend that belief against any potential criticism that could be alleged at it? We can't do that if you don't know what those potential objections are, right? And so this is the approach of philosophy. Your knowledge, right? Your confidence in the truth of something, right, is much better grounded, much easier to defend if you've already imagined the objections to your own views, right? So it's a way of, again, approaching all your beliefs in the world, right? Why do I believe all of the things that I do? And assessing all of those by the same standards. And if you think that religious beliefs should be assessed by different standards, then we have to ask ourselves why, right? Why should we assess religious beliefs differently than we assess other types of beliefs? Okay. If we think it's okay to take certain things on faith in one domain of our lives, then can we take other things on faith in other domains? And if not, why not? Again, I'm not saying yes or no, right? That's not my job, but we're always going to be asking why, right? And then our job is to learn how to assess whatever answers are given. Okay, so now I want you all to picture that you were in a class, right? And you have spent like all quarter working on this project, and you had to get up in front of the whole class and give this presentation, right? It's really important to you. And nobody asked any questions at the end. How would you take that?
That they weren't interested in what I was talking about.
Absolutely, right? So if anyone is ever upset by questions, right? I want you to think of this situation, right? Asking questions is a sign of interest and a sign of respect. Now, people can be disrespectful, right, in the way they formulate a question, but the mere act of asking questions is not itself a sign of disrespect, okay? It's an intent to understand, right? That is showing respect, that you think that something is worthy of an attempt to try to understand it, right? So again, this is, I think, the biggest holdup for people. One of the biggest initial barriers to having these conversations is that most of us have just been shut down so many times, anytime we've tried to have them, right? Or we've seen other people get shut down. And so we first have to be willing to just ask the questions initially, whatever those questions are. So, and I hope this is something you take with you in your life. Again, it's not just about religious belief, about anything anyone is claiming to be true. You should always be able to ask questions. If you are not allowed to ask questions, that should be an immediate red flag, right? Because let me tell you, anyone who has bothered to do the work of defending their beliefs, right, to make sure that they do have that solid foundation, they will be more than happy to share with you all of the reasons why you should, right? Someone who has done that work is happy to share it, right? It's not a burden for them to have to share that wisdom with you. So if they don't want to, that either means that they don't have good reasons behind it, or they're covering up for a bad reason, right? And sometimes it could be both, right? It could be a bad reason that they also just maybe aren't even aware of. So we want to make sure, again, that we're willing to ask questions, and some people are not comfortable with that, right? Maybe some people living the life of a philosopher is not for you, and that's okay. No judgment. But I will say then this class is probably not for you, because we are going to be engaging in these questions every week, and we are going to have to engage with answers to those questions, right? Assessing how strong we think they are, what other people have said about how strong those arguments are or not, right? And so again, I want to at least make sure that we're willing and prepared to engage with the asking of those questions. But I also want to make it very clear that when we disagree, we are never criticizing or critiquing a person who holds a belief, Okay, we are only ever talking about statements, right? So we will be having discussions about the statement, God exists, right? That is a sentence. We can discuss whether that sentence has a truth value, right? Or we can discuss how we would assess the truth value of that statement, right? And based on whatever reasoning we think we have to assess the truth value of the statement God exists, then maybe we can discuss whether or not we think it's rational for people to believe in that proposition. But we will never be criticizing any individual person. Are we clear on that? Okay, so this is not about us and our individual beliefs. This is about why we think things are true, right? Or likely to be true. Okay, why do we think this thing is the case or this thing is not the case? Or why do we think it's more likely that this is the case? All right, so again, this first week, we're just embracing asking these questions and learning some vocabulary so that we can organize and approach these questions in a clear and productive fashion, right? So there are different ways of approaching all of the questions that we're going to be talking about, right? So we want to know what it means to approach them philosophically. So for example, when we do discuss religious belief, in philosophy, we call that religious epistemology. Okay, it's the study of the nature of knowledge and justified true belief. But you could always do, religious psychology, and you could look at like patterns of how religious ideas emerge. That's a little bit different than what we're going to be studying, right? So you might be familiar with like what Freud has said about the role that religion has played. Like that's a different discipline. We're not going to be approaching it that way. We're going to be assessing, again, propositions, right? Whether or not people have said they're true or false and what reasons they have given, right, in support of those things. So a couple other things that I wanted to mention. Just floated in my brain and then left. Well, since I'm on the topic of some terminology, as we're introducing philosophy this week, that was the idea. Good. So I'm on the same train of thought. So philosophy itself is a really broad field, right? So I already mentioned that we're going to be approaching it philosophically and not as far as other academic disciplines, but that boundary can often be difficult to draw. And that's because if any of you know about the history of higher education, you know that any high degree that you get in college, the highest degree possible is a PhD. So that means that no matter what you major in, if you get the highest degree possible, you become a doctor of philosophy. And the reason for that is that philosophy was the first form of higher education. And as Bertrand Russell's going to talk about in this first reading that you have this week, he's going to discuss the fact that other disciplines in academia only emerged when there was a consensus to an answer, right? So the areas that remain under the domain of philosophy are the things that we haven't necessarily, right, come to as much of a consensus on. Not to say that there's still not like philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of science questioning their way they're doing things, right? But philosophy as a whole, right, tends to still focus on the things that we're still not sure about. So as you can imagine, religion is going to be a big part of that, right? And it's going to cross into lots of these different fields. So there will be a little bit of, social anthropology, right? You need to know about the history of a religion a little bit to know about what its doctrines are, right? What it establishes as truth, especially because those things change over time, right? History, traditions change over time. So what it might be a religious doctrine at one moment in time may not have even existed in that tradition earlier on, right? So if it's creating a philosophical problem, that could actually be useful for us, right? So knowing those kinds of details can be helpful. But there are ways that we can categorize philosophy, again, to help us organize it. And we can do that into three main subdisciplines. So I mentioned epistemology already. The other one we're coming across this week, which is logic, right? So these are, when you're learning about deductive and inductive arguments, right? These are just ways of organizing our thinking and our reasoning so that we can assess other people's arguments better, right? So we'll be able to take someone's views from like a really intense paper and boil it down to say a couple sentences and be able to assess the meat of what they're trying to say, right? So that's how the tools of logic are going to help us. It's also useful in coding, if any of you are interested in the tech stuff, logical implication. There's a lot you can do with that in the coding world. So they're good things to know. But so these are the four basic areas that we're going to be coming across as we go through our philosophical questions specifically related to religion, right? So we're going to see logic come up a lot in attributes for God, right? So trying to figure out if it is logically possible for, say, an all-powerful being to create a stone too heavy for them to lift. So we're going to have lots of logical paradoxes to engage in, right? So, right, dealing with these things in a purely intellectual fashion, not based on empirical evidence, is going to be new for a lot of us, right? And so it's going to be a different way of thinking about it. It feels very technical, but it's meant to follow a set of rules, right, so that we can more easily assess it. So spend some time getting familiar with the notion of validity this week, right? Because that's going to be our primary indicator. We want deductively valid arguments, right? Those are going to be the strongest ones the best ones we can have. Hopefully they'll end up being sound, meaning their premises are true, but we don't know if we can prove that these things are true yet. So at best, we can make a deductively valid argument, right? And so you're actually going to see this too when we get to arguments for God's existence, right? We're going to see a couple of different approaches to this. Can we argue for the existence of a God or gods based on observation? Or is it a purely intellectual pursuit? And so logic is going to play an important role. People are going to argue that you can argue God's existence just intellectually alone, right? That you don't even need to do it from something grounded in empiricism. Right, so fascinating stuff. So that gets us into metaphysics, which is the study of the nature of reality, right? So again, what is God like? Or is there a God? What is that God like? Again, what does it mean for us? So is there a soul? Is there an afterlife? What is that afterlife like? I mentioned that we're going to be studying religious epistemology. Specifically, we're going to talk about the rationality of belief in God and the rationality of belief in miracles, the occurrence of miracles, since miracles or religious experience are often used as proof of God's existence, right? So we want to assess those as a means to a metaphysical claim. And then, of course, I think some of the most important stuff we'll save for the end, which is axiology, the study of ethics and values, right? So a lot of people, the reason why religion is so important to them, one of the many, right, is that a lot of people think or get their sense of moral code, right, of right and wrong from their religious traditions. So we need to assess that, right? Is it from just one particular religious doctrine that the right moral code, right? How do we know which religion gives us the right set of ethics? And then, of course, the penultimate philosophical question, known as the Euthyphro problem, right? Does goodness exist independently of God? So this little paradox, you might have heard of it. The question is, are things good because God likes them, right? Or does God like things because they're already good, right? So it's kind of like a which came first, chicken or the egg thing, right? The things that God says are right, were they already right? And that's why God has, proclaimed them to be? Or are they right only because God says so? And the reason that it's called the Euthyphro problem is that it's paradoxical. It's paradoxical because neither answer really serves God well, right? So we're going to be encountering all these types of things, right? What does it really mean, right, to hold these beliefs? And again, if we want to consider, why this matters, I might ask you, and again, this is something Bertrand Russell's going to talk about this week, how you think our beliefs are affected to affect our actions, right? How we make our way in the world. Clearly, religious beliefs have an impact, right, on things in the world. Clearly, they affect politics, right? Even though we have wanted to pretend throughout the history of America that they don't, right? Deeply intertwined. And so, can you really treat somebody as an equal if you think they're going to hell, right? Can you really, respect someone as a human being, and right, honor their wishes if you think what they're doing is morally wrong and reprehensible? Probably not, right? Right, so we really have to think about the idea. Again, this is just motivation for asking the questions, right? Because again, a lot of what you might think are right and wrong maybe were just taught to you, and maybe you didn't really get a chance to have a say in whether or not you agree with those things. And this is just an invitation to do that, right? I'm not saying everyone needs to disregard what you were told. I'm not saying that, right? I'm just inviting you to reflect on whether or not you want to believe the things you believe, right? We don't often get that invitation, right? So think about the things that you were taught. I have definitely had moments in my life where I was like, whoa, I clearly had a bias there, right? And I had to reflect on that, and I had to call myself out on it, right? And do some thinking. And those moments are uncomfortable, which is why a lot of people don't do it, right? But that's not an excuse, right? We want to embrace that discomfort and derive from it what is sorely lacking in the world today, which is called intellectual humility, right? It is okay if we don't know all the answers to these things. In fact, Bertrand Russell is going to try to convince you that it's better not to make up your mind about these things yet, right? So if we're asking these questions, if we really want to understand the nature of reality and our place within it, right? If you decide today that you already know the answer, how much are you really going to learn, right? Compared to if you never decide you know the answer, right? If you keep searching, keep exploring all the different possible answers, right? So again, we get some more like poetic philosopher stuff about, the wisest person being the people who admit they don't know anything, right? It's again, just embracing uncertainty instead of being so arrogant to think that we have it all figured out, right? Because again, human beings have been and still are notoriously fallible in a lot of important ways. And, this is something we're not going to be able to get into in this class, but if you're interested, there are a lot of other ethical implications of these views. So I teach another class once a year, Women in World Religions, right? And we talk about how the metaphysical views of different religious traditions imply certain gender hierarchies, right? So if God created man before woman, right, and created man in God's image, but only created woman in part of the image of man, right, that creates a clear hierarchy of value, as opposed to a different origin story where man and woman were created at the same time, both in the image of God. Those two creation stories come from the same Abrahamic traditions, right? So which one are we going to pick? What implications does it have for how we view ourselves, and again, how we think the world ought to be set up? So they're really, really important implications for these ideas. I also want to emphasize the epistemology bit. So that's my baby. That's what got me into philosophy. So for me, it all comes back to epistemology. But I was always really interested in the difference between someone just believing in God, right? Like, yeah, lots of people believe in God, but someone claiming to know, right? Claiming to have knowledge, like that, there's like a higher bar, right? That we set for that, to know something for sure. And so I've always been curious, like how do we meet that bar, that standard, right? And does it differ, right? Because surely in some cases we want to say that, you could know something based on your experience, and that your personal experience would be totally valid for you to believe, but might not be valid for me to believe, right? So again, how do we form our religious beliefs? Well, mostly it's on the testimony of others. So how do we take that on ourselves? How do we acquire sufficient evidence for our beliefs? And again, there's lots of different interesting views about this, but I always want to encourage you to be your own final authority on your beliefs, right? Your consent, your autonomy on what goes into your brain, okay? Question everything, right? And we always want to ask who is going to be most benefited from what we believe, right? Who is going to be most harmed by what we believe? And that's something that we're going to look at as well. In this class, we're going to look at different approaches to philosophy of religion. So philosophy, you may or may not be surprised by this, like most forms of higher education, has been pretty exclusive, pretty white, pretty male, pretty Christian, right? Pretty straight. all of these things that have tended historically to privilege a select few. So we are going to be rounding off the class with other approaches to philosophy of religion. So I'm still building out that module, but so far we're going to include feminist philosophy of religion, African philosophies of religion, and I'm looking to include Islamic philosophies of religion as well. So again, I just want to make sure that we are aware that, just because most of the readings come from this set of dudes, right? They didn't come up with these ideas. They're probably not the first ones to have them. And there might even be some problems with the fact that they were so exclusionary in their practice, right? And that so many individuals were left out. And again, they're going to be arguing for very specific types of gods, right? Which is going to be a potential problem, right? Why just the Abrahamic conception of God should follow from some of these arguments, right? And so looking at different types of spiritual metaphysics, right? Things that argue for the existence of maybe there are also angels or demons or jinn or right ancestral spirits, right? There are all sorts of other supernatural entities that could exist. What role do they play, right? How do we know about that system? So again, I think it's really fun. I think these are the questions that we tend to ask ourselves the most, anyways. So I'm very glad that you're all here. This is one of my favorite classes to teach. Again, it's the class that got me into philosophy. So I hope that you enjoy it. I do want to spend a little bit of time making sure that we're all familiar and comfortable with the Canvas setup. I obviously like color and am very organized. So I hope that works for you. If it doesn't, I apologize. But I'm doing my best to match what's intuitive for me to also be intuitive for you. So please let me know if you can't find anything. But the one thing I have done is I made everything the same every week, right? So at least it won't ever be a surprise. So it can often seem like a lot of information, but please note that very little of it is actually required, right? So I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you a little bit of what Canvas looks like for those of you who haven't had a chance to poke around yet. But when you join our page, it'll take you to this homepage where you can jump around the class in different ways, right? So I've organized it by week. We'll be going over one sort of main topic every week, and your assignments are grouped with that content, right? So every week there's a discussion, every week there's a quiz, and the discussion and quiz will be about whatever we talked about that week, right? And so you can jump ahead here. Class information here, as well as these study flashcards, which are new and in beta, which I'm super excited about. And then, or you could just jump straight to assignments. So again, one for each week. So discussion one and quiz one, right? Same week, two, same and so on and so forth. Embedded in our discussion. So our discussions have two parts. There's the initial post, and then there's the part where you're responding. That's what makes it a discussion. But you're also going to be putting up pieces of your writing assignment every week. So what I have done is we only have one paper for this class, but what I've done is I've broken that paper up into little pieces. It's called scaffolding. And so there's a little piece of your paper embedded in each discussion. So you can go through them week by week. If you're ever curious about the entire assignment, you can click right here. It'll take you to my website. So this is just an overview of the whole assignment because some people have a hard time conceiving it piece by piece, right? They want to know how it works together. Basically, what we're doing is we're Ping an argument. That's an acronym. Stands for present, explain, evaluate, right? So you're going to be presenting a deductively valid argument for some position that you take on a topic of your choice. We're going to be explaining it eventually with 3 paragraphs, right? You're going to be defining your terms, telling a story of why it's important, defending your argument, and then eventually we'll get into the more philosophical parts where we imagine objections to our own views and have to respond to them, right? So again, you can get a sense of the overall thing here, but all of this, again, just drafts, right? So try to get something in each week so you can get some feedback. It will all lead up to the final draft, which is where you will definitely want to have made revisions. And that final draft is worth 100 points. So that's a huge part of the grade. So it's really in your best interest to keep up with these little weekly drafts, right? So that you have a solid piece of writing sort of done by the end of the term, okay? So for those of you who have been able to poke around, right, again, you'll see everything's arranged in tabs. Please note that while there is a lot in here, the media and lectures are all optional, right? So this is extra support, right? Obviously, lectures are from me. The media are videos, news articles, podcasts, things that are for those of us who are maybe more visual or auditory learners, right? Not all of us do well with just reading comprehension. So again, I'm just trying to provide things that work for all different learning styles, right? So don't be overwhelmed. Don't feel like you have to go through all of this. The minimum that you need to do is read anything marked read, right, in this first page. Okay, so there's a lot this first week, but these are all really short. And there's some optional stuff as well, right, embedded without, but typically that's what you're required. That's all you're required to be responsible for in the week. And then you can look at the media if you'd like, but I definitely do recommend at least going through the PowerPoints if you can't watch the recorded lectures. So remember I mentioned there were 2 parts, Intro to Philosophy of Religion, and then we get into the divine attributes. So maybe start on the Intro to Philosophy of Religion, right? Because that is a sub-discipline of philosophy, but it covers, right? It kind of crosses over all the other sub-disciplines. So again, these are just organizational tools, but they're important for us to understand the traditions we're about to start familiarizing ourselves with, right? So these are important traditions, long-lasting traditions, traditions whose honestly debates are still going on today, for better or for worse. That frustrates a lot of people about philosophy, right? Like, can't believe we're still having the same debate, but that must mean that we have not come up with a convincing enough answer for it yet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.